Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Whether you're a farmer, researcher, or educator, visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can work for you. It's time for another episode of the Pest and Predators podcast. Joining us here today is Dr. Boyd Mori from the University of Alberta. Boyd, it's great to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shaun.
Okay, we're going to talk, obviously, when we're talking about pests and predators, we're going to talk about some critters that are trying to attack our crops and rob us of yields. And we always tie it into some of the critters that are out in our canopy that are actually trying to help us. You know, we've seen a great evolution of seed treatments. Now, we know they're effective, but it's not the only tool that we have available to us. It's not like a silver bullet sort of scenario, is it?
Right, yeah. So we've done quite a bit of work on seed treatments, foliar applied insecticides, but we're also focusing on biological control. So those predator insects that are out there that can help us in our fields, and we don't have to do anything for them, right? We don't have to apply anything. They're just naturally out there. So yeah, considering what else is out there, not just our chemical products, is also very beneficial for us.
And I guess our seed treatments, like, I'm trying to get a gauge on, are they just as effective as previously? Are they more effective now? Or is that a kind of an unfair question?
Right. Well, we've done some follow-up work. So back in 2008, there's a publication that showed that the striped flea beetles were more tolerant of the neonicotinoid seed treatments. And so we followed up this work a few years ago now, and we came to the same conclusion, is that the striped flea beetles do appear to be more tolerant. So we see less mortality in striped flea beetles when we compare them to crucifer flea beetles. Interestingly, with our new results, crucifer flea beetles also were starting to show some tolerance. This was after only 72 hours. So if we brought that out to a longer time period, would we have seen more mortality? Potentially. And we were also using very high density of flea beetles. So probably kind of what would be considered more of like outbreak conditions in a field. But still, it is showing that conditions and times might be changing with the effectiveness of some of these neonicotinoid products.
Okay, so seed treatments aren't, they're not the toolbox, they're a tool. What else encompasses this integrated pest management strategy that we need to be focused on? What other tools are there available?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, even with the seed treatments, although we weren't seeing, particularly with the crucifer, we weren't seeing as high levels of mortality as we were expecting, we did see a reduction in damage. And so my postdoc who was working on the project actually did a nice experiment where he showed basically that the crucifer flea beetles prefer to move to seedlings that were grown from untreated seed. So there's a repellent or almost like an anti-feedant effect from these products. So that's a benefit with those products. And then of course, if we have very high conditions, we can always resort to a foliar applied product. But then stepping away from products, we can look at beneficial insects that are out there. And so our fields are full of different insects that we may be thinking about, we may not. A lot of us might just see them as, big black beetles or little black beetles in the field. But there's lots of different ground beetles. We found in our study over 108 families of insects. 108 families, different families of insects. And so there was over the ground beetle. So it was the data I'm particularly talking about was a 2-year study. We collected over 90,000 ground beetles alone over kind of bi-weekly throughout the summer. And the vast majority of those were one particular ground species. Doesn't have a common name, unfortunately, but it's called Pterosticus melanarius. And it's a generalist, but it's out there and it can feed on a variety of things, including flea beetles and other pest species within our fields.
That's actually 108 different. So how many those are families?
Right.
So, and then there's also species inside the families, or
correct.
I'm just trying to get a handle on this.
Yeah. So very large scope. So we just have, incidental insects that we can just might be passing through, but we have things like pollinators, we have predators, we have pests. And so we have, yeah, we can break it down. So families, and then within families, we may have multiple beetle species. I think we had over 20 ground beetle species alone that we identified in these fields, probably more than that, to be honest. And then we also looked at spiders. And so my student, when she was looking at spiders, also found a plethora of spiders. I think it was over just spiders. I think it was over 70 spider families. So there's a ton of different arthropods, not just insects within these fields.
When we look at, you mentioned flea beetles. When we look at trying to control the pest, what makes them so difficult?
That's a great question. I think part of it is their sporadic nature. We don't have very good predictive tools of where we're going to find them from year to year, and that's a reason why basically 100% of our acres are have a seed treatment on them. It's this proactive treatment, but it's very beneficial because it's basically insurance, right? It's risk prevention. Um, and so we don't have a very good handle on their sporadic nature. We know a little bit about their overwintering mortality, but not a whole lot.
Hmm.
We know, for instance, that striped flea beetles usually come out a little bit earlier in the season. They tolerate cooler temperatures than crucifer flea beetles. But generally, we say, any day over 15 degrees Celsius, you'll probably find flea beetles in your field in the spring. But that's just some very generalizations. And so that I think is a big thing. We also know, of course, there is a smorgasbord, if you want to say, of host plants out there for flea beetles. So not only are they feeding on our canola crops, they could feed on mustards, they could feed on a lot of our weedy crucifers, right? Like things like stinkweed, flicksweed, so other these winter annuals that are out there. And so there's a variety of hosts for them, which can also complicate the situation.
Hmm. And is that so based on that sporadicness, um, is that why foliars are kind of hit and miss on the effective side? The application of the foliar is not as easy as if we are, say, spraying for lygus bugs in crop.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think one thing we're seeing, of course, is lower seeding rates
Oh yeah.
than kind of historically. And so that's even concentrating flea beetles on fewer plants. So you might actually have the same population, but if you have fewer plants for them to feed on within your field, it's going to concentrate and, of course, enhance the damage on those seedlings. I think Canola Council in one of their recent newsletters actually had a very nice diagram showing that exact same thing. If you have a nice even emergence of your canola crop in the spring, that's actually going to be a dilution effect of the flea beetles. So they're going to spread out over your crop, which is fine because you also have to remember for seed treatments to be effective, flea beetles do have to feed on the crop, right?
Right.
They need to ingest that in order to uptake that insecticide.
Yeah, we want intake. It's
Exactly.
not a
Yeah.
repellent. We want to see some activity so that we are, getting the product is able to do its thing.
Hmm.
Now, and some growers have another tool in the toolbox that growers have used is playing with seeding dates with the
Right.
idea that, we were really going early at one point. But what some growers were finding is you get some little bit, touch of frost activity. It's a little chillier. Crop is held back at a stage, and it kind of gives the flea beetle some time to, for that too much activity. And so
Right.
getting more of a lusher crop, you kind of get out ahead of them and get past that cold stage. That's also a tool.
Right, exactly. And even think about, when we are seeding, if we're seeding into very dry soils, if that seed's sitting there, or maybe it germinates and that seedling's sitting there without a lot of growth, maybe it cools down again. That also gives, it's that vulnerable stage. We really want to get through to that, basically that third true leaf stage, and then it can tolerate flea beetle feeding.
So, Boyd, one of the things I wonder about And I don't know what the adoption like. We've been talking about beneficial index in insects for a while. Okay,
Hmm.
is one of the gaps to see, for farmers to see it as like consistently effective is we don't really like. I don't. I've got a field out there. I know if I apply a herbicide or I'm using a street treatment, I know the control is present, or the sorry, that's not the control is not the right word, but the product is it's there because I've applied it. In case of beneficials, can I rely on them? Do I know if there's enough there? Like, is that one of the gaps for people?
I think so, right? You don't see that instantaneous effect too, right?
Right.
So first off, like there some of them are very cryptic, right? If we're talking ground beetles, they're on the soil surface. They even the larval stage is within the soil, so they're predators, but they're within the soil, so you will never see the larvae unless you're digging around in the soil. So I think that's part of it is you don't really see them. You don't often know they're there. Um, and then measuring their impact is also quite difficult, right?
Okay.
And and it's that kind of, I guess if you go back to like an undergrad biology class and you talk about like predator prey dynamics, it's also like, do we have so many flea beetles in our field if we're just focusing on flea beetles that can we have enough predators to really make a difference? Um, and I think it's what we are seeing is that we're seeing the benefit of flea beetles when there are kind of moderate populations. When we're under outbreaking populations, I just don't think our predators can keep up and help to maintain or manage that population.
And where do dynamic thresholds fit into this conversation?
Right? Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's difficult, particularly for flea beetles, because it's such early season.
Yeah.
The crop is so vulnerable to monitor for the predators early in the season. Can be difficult. You can't just sweep through the crop and see what you have in your sweep bag. This for the ones that we're focusing on, they're ground dwelling. So we're using pitfall traps, which are basically just cups buried to the even with the soil surface, and an insect walks and falls right in, and then you can count and see how many you have. So I'd say it's difficult that way. I think if we think more season long and knowing that the flea beetles that we're seeing at the end of the season are going to contribute to, and that's what we're going to see the following spring. If we can think about that a little bit more and what's happening later in the season to those flea beetles, I think that's where we might see better kind of not bang for a buck, but like, yeah, a better interaction. And farmers may actually be able to see what's going on there in terms of lots of different beneficial insects that may be feeding on those flea beetles.
How adaptive are flea beetles? Like are they continuing to stay out ahead of us in some of this? Like, I'm curious on your thoughts there. What have you observed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know, a few years ago, Julie Soroka showed that the striped flea beetles were kind of moving further south out of their historical range, where we would say more, they used to be more kind of parkland, Peace River region. Um, and then, so of course, that's a bit of an adaptation. But I would say in recent years, we've kind of seen this contraction as well, where we're not seeing them as far south as previous. Um, so I think, they're very flexible, and but in terms of like how they're actually like truly adapting, and if this is like a almost a genetic shift in the last few years, I don't think we can say anything truly about that yet. Um, if we want to talk about adaptation to insecticides, we've done work with the synthetic pyrethroids, so the foliar applied products, right? Your kind of recovery spray if you need to spray a product following a seed treatment, and luckily for us, with that, with both crucifer and striped, we've seen no resistance developing across the prairies. So we've
Hmm.
had populations from Manitoba to the Peace region that we've tested both crucifer and striped, and those were all highly effective products against both species. And so when we do hear about things like, oh, I had to spray multiple times for flea beetles, then I think rather than immediately thinking of a resistance issue, we have to be thinking more of like an application issue,
Okay.
or maybe a reinvasion. Populations can be incredibly high, and so particularly, if your field is surrounded by other canola fields and you spray, nobody else does, you might be seeing a reinvasion of your field.
We got to get all the neighbors on the same page here,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
A little bit of area-wide pest management needs to happen in some instances.
Okay, to that point, how how far does a flea beetle move?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think anyone's actually determined that. We
Okay.
know they could, we know they're very able flyers, right? I live in the middle of the city. My kids have a yellow slide in our backyard, and every spring it is coated in flea beetles. And that's from them just moving around. We know they can fly at different heights. And of course, they're so tiny that a windy day they can be pushed around, you know, tens, if not hundreds of kilometers. But I don't think anyone's actually measured, and partly it's because they're so difficult to track, an individual and whatnot.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that is back to your neighbor comment, right? Like
Hmm.
how big of a radius of neighbors do I need to be talking about? Like, okay, we need to like let's work together on this.
Right. And I don't have a good answer for that, but they
Yeah,
could definitely, hop from field to field for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it is good to be on the same page to know what others are doing. That's not to say someone is spraying, you should spray, but at least they're spraying for a reason. So you should be out in your field having a look and considering those factors.
Right. Hey, we do that all the time, right? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's Ralph doing over there?
Yeah.
What
Exactly.
are we spraying for? I better should go look at my own fields.
Yeah.
What does he know that I don't know? Okay. Now you mentioned the effectiveness of ground beetles and some spiders. I ask this all the time on this podcast. How do if I know that they're effective as a biological control, a beneficial insect,
Hmm.
how do I enhance how do I enhance their population? And
Right.
I guess if I can, it can too much be too much.
Right. Yeah. So I think, I honestly think seed treatments are helping us with beneficial insects, right? Uh you're putting them in the ground, it's going into the plant. Whereas if you're spraying a foliar applied insecticide, insecticides will kill insects. So they will kill the ground beetles, potentially the spiders within your field with a foliar applied product. Um, and so there, I think we can that alone is helping to conserve some of those beneficial insects in our fields. We've also done some work with our study. We were looking at both along the edge and in the interior field to just see how the populations differ, or if we're finding the same species in both spots, or are we finding more of one species in the interior fields compared to the edges. Just knowing that the edge, of course, is closer to the field margin, either the ditch or maybe there's a hedgerow, a shelter belt of some sort, which has higher plant diversity, potential alternative prey items for those predators. And so we do see that we see higher abundance towards the edge of fields, and we generally see higher diversity in terms of ground beetle species towards the edge of fields. Um, and so I think there's also been work out of the University of Calgary, Paul Galpern's lab, work out of Alejandro Costabega's lab at the University of Manitoba, that does show that there's these edge effects related to both spiders and ground beetles. Um, and so conserving some of these, I think Paul Galpern likes to call them like marginal lands around the fields,
Hmm.
it can really help promote biodiversity. It can offer not only kind of refuge outside of the crop for these beneficial insects, it can in terms of habitat, but it can also offer alternative prey items for them. And so just helping to conserve those areas around your fields, I think is also a benefit. I don't think we're there trying to say, we need to divide up our fields, make them smaller scale, get out of these quarter sections to try and increase the plant diversity within our fields yet. But that's, of course, if we think of Europe and their smaller scales, they do see a benefit in that kind of smaller fields because of that kind of edge to area or edge to interior ratio, knowing that the edges have higher diversity in them. And so you get that kind of spillover effect into your crop.
You probably know what I'm going to ask next. So on a quarter section, how wide does my grass area need to be, Boyd?
Yeah, and I don't think anyone's done the work there either.
Okay.
And maybe I haven't looked recently. But we were using, naturally occurring, whatever, the ditch
The
is
tree
between the edge
line,
of
the
the
ditch,
field and
yeah.
the tree. Yeah. And like even just to the range route. So not, sometimes it was, just a couple meters. Most of the time, maybe like 3, 4, 5 meters
Mm.
at most. And so that's kind of what we were looking at. But we were seeing a benefit even there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So we get stuff to learn there. What other gaps are there in some of our research that we're still trying to sort out as it relates to, say, like flea beetles and beneficials and this ecosystem?
Yeah, I think a big one is, and some work that we've been working on is like we can talk about beneficial insects and we can say, oh, there's big-eyed bugs, there's ambush bugs, there's these um different species of spiders and ground beetles in your field. But we don't actually know what's feeding on flea beetles.
Hmm.
So we have some incidental observations, like if you look through the kind of published literature, some of those first things are a couple people saw, this particular ground beetle species feeding on a flea beetle in a field, just kind of observationally. So one approach that we've been taking, and actually in conjunction with Alejandro Costamanga at University of Manitoba, is looking at the gut content of these predator insects, and then we can determine what they're actually feeding on within the field. Because another thing is, you give a predator, a prey item in a dish in the laboratory. It's hungry. It doesn't have any alternatives. It's going to feed on it,
Right.
right? But if you're out in the field, there's options, right? And so maybe there's earthworms, maybe there's little other, aphids that have fallen to the ground, other things that it could feed on. So we want to now know, like, directly from the field, we can take these predators, we can look at their gut content, and we can say, oh yes, this one's eaten flea beetles, at least within the last 24 hours. And I think that's part of a gap that we're starting to fill. To truly say, like, these things are actually eating these pests in the field. And I think that's a starting point, because then we want to know, okay, well, they're eating them, but how many are they eating, right? And
Right.
how often? Which is also that's another hurdle. It's like, well, how many can they eat? Um, and and a lot of these, particularly if we're talking about predators, they can be generalists. And so they might even be feeding on seeds in a field too, right? And so, or weed seeds. So what is the likelihood that it will pick and eat the seed over a flea beetle that's there? One's immobile, just sitting there. The flea beetle can run away. So I think these are things we have to consider in the trade-offs, and think about that more.
And what the difficulty here is because of the size, correct?
Right.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
like we're like, hey, what is the cougar eating? Like
Yeah.
right? We can visually we can see that more from observation, but we can also we open the stomach, we're like, oh, okay, we can kind of figure this out pretty quickly. We're talking about
Right.
very small insects here. Um,
Right.
and the quest to try to sort out in these piecing this together is is that bit what we think is a beneficial, if it's also eating the crop, not so beneficial. And
Right.
then trying to sort out like how many ground, in the case of ground beetles, how many ground beetles of this type do we need to be actually deemed as like an effective biological control? Like, if they're eating one flea beetle every day, probably not. We're gonna need way too many ground beetles
Right.
covered in them, right? So, like,
Yeah.
very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and like one I think totally unexplored area is those ground beetle larvae that I mentioned earlier because they're in the soil. Flea beetle larvae, once, we usually talk about the adults, but flea beetle larvae are actually in the soil as well in the summer. And so is what's happening there. So some of those are most likely being eaten by these predator larvae, but we don't know. And so that's a whole
So how do you
totally
figure that out?
unexplored.
Because it's out of
Yeah.
the visual sight. Like, so how do you figure that out?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is we would have to kind of figure out what's the density of these predator larvae, but also the flea beetle larvae within a field. And then I think we would kind of similarly what we've been doing with the adults is looking at the gut content. We could look at content of these predator larvae in the field because we can do it just based off of DNA. So we can determine, what other species DNA do these predatory larvae have within their gut. So I
Hmm.
think that's one way we could at least start to get after that.
Boy, this stuff is so cool. So
It
cool.
is. It's a very fun line of work, I must say.
We're making a difference, right? We connect some of these dots. It allows us to tackle a pest and control a pest that creates significant economic damage depending on the year. Like if
Yeah.
you ask farmers, what is the pest that frustrates you the most when it comes to canola? I don't have that list in front of me, but honestly, flea beetles are near the top, bud. Like they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. I would
Like
agree.
because,
For insects, absolutely.
right, we want to get our crop we want to launch it out of the ground to get the best start we can. And flea beetles are between us and that goal. It's, besides Mother Nature not cooperating early on in the season. So we've been talking here today to Dr. Boyd Mori. He is with the University of Alberta. Boyd, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Pest and Predator podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.